Today we're going to continue our stories on Joshua, and our story today comes from Joshua 20, 21, and 22, and our key verse is in Joshua 21:45 that says, "Not one word of the good promises that the Lord had made to the house of Israel had failed. All came to pass." So today we're going to be looking at some of the things about the principles that God made to the Israelites and how he kept all of his promises. When we started our study in Joshua, we learned how God's promises lead us. It's an amazing thing to realize that not one of all the Lord's good promises to his people failed. Everyone was fulfilled. In this lesson, we are going to study 5 points about the promises of God. As we learn what is in each chapter, I want you to remember how these 5 points and how to apply them to your life. Number 1, the work must go on. The Lord told Joshua that he was too old to go into battle, yet there were still pockets of enemies living inside the borders of the Promised Land. There was still work to do. Joshua told the people that the responsibility for driving out the enemy was given to each tribe who lived in the land. God gave the gift of peace to all the tribes so that they could make homes for themselves and their families. They were no longer pilgrims, they were home. But just because they now had land, just because they enjoyed peace and the major war was over, didn't mean they could sit back and do nothing. No, God still had work for them to do. There were still unfinished business. The work must go on. So even though the children of Israel were in the Promised Land, God still had things for them to do. Number 2, faith moves mountains. There was one very old man who understood what Joshua meant when he told the tribes, the work must go on. This man was Caleb. Caleb was very special to Joshua. He was the only man besides Joshua in the whole nation of the Hebrews that actually left Egypt and arrived in the Promised Land. Everyone else, including Moses and Aaron, had died in the wilderness. Caleb was at least 85 years old. God had told Moses to promise Caleb a special inheritance in the Promised Land because of his faith. Remember that Caleb and Joshua were the only 2 of the 12 spies that believed in God's promise. Caleb reminds Joshua of the promise that Moses made. He receives first choice of land. Do you suppose that Caleb would ask for a nice, flat, fertile valley by the Jordan River where the fields were green and the fruit trees grew? No, he did not. He did not want an easy place. In Joshua 14:12, Caleb says, "Give me this mountain where the giants live with the Lord helping me, and I will force them out, just as God promised." Caleb knew that the mountain fortress would be full of battles and very tough challenges. He also knew that God would be with him, and guess what? Caleb took the mountain of Hebron and drove out all the giants in the land. In fact, he was the only one who completely succeeded in driving the enemy away from the land out of all the 12 tribes. Yes, that is what true faith in God can move mountains. Number 3, accidents happen. Following the division of the lands of the tribe, God instructed Joshua to set up 6 cities of refuge. Moses had given the rule before the land was even taken. The times had come for Joshua to follow the instructions and appoint 6 cities to be cities of safety. What is a city of safety for? Well, God's promises included giving protection to someone who had killed someone by accident or without meaning to. Because life is very, very special to God, the taking of a life by anyone other than God was a serious crime. But God knew that accidents would happen, and so he wanted to provide a safe place for these people. And so these cities would be called the cities of refuge that they could go to there and await a sort of trial. If they were accepted into the city of protection, they could stay there, and they had to live there until the high priest had died. God wanted all the tribes to have access to a city of refuge so that the 6 cities were located in the north and the center and south and on both sides of the Jordan River. Number 4, surrounded to serve. All of the tribes of Israel received land grants, right? Yes and no. The tribes of the 10 sons and 2 grandsons of Jacob received land grants for the whole tribes. The tribe of Levi was given a total of 48 cities to live in within the borders of the other 10 tribes. Why did God surround the tribe of Levi, the people of Levi, with the other tribes? To answer that question, let's think about the special job given to this tribe. When the Israelites traveled in the wilderness, the Levites were responsible for the tabernacle, Israel's meeting tent. The priests who were from the tribe of Levi were the ones to offer the sacrifices and lead the people in worship. They were to teach God's people his law, both religious law and those that govern their nation. If God put all the people in charge of worship and taking care of the tabernacle and his teaching, his word, in all one place together, what would the rest of the people do who wanted to worship God or learn more about God? God placed the cities of Levites in strategic planned locations. The cities were near the borders between the tribes so that they lived surrounded by the people they served. One of the most important jobs of the 6 of the Levitical cities is that they were the cities of refuge and of safety. This meant that the Levites would serve as judges as well as being a center for worship and learning about God. Number 5, motives matter. So in this one, we're going to be reading a couple different verses. So Joshua called a meeting of all the soldiers from the tribe of Reuben, Gad, and half of the tribe of Manasseh. He had bragged that in the way that they had obeyed God and praised them for the ways that they had supported other tribes to fight for the western side of the promised land. So in Joshua 22, verse 4, it says, "Now the Lord your God has given rest to your brothers as he promised. Therefore return and go to your tents in a land where your possessions lie, which Moses the servant of your Lord gave you on the other side of the Jordan." So God had promised the Israelites peace, and he had kept that promise, and what Joshua gave them to do was permission to go home to their lands and their families. With this blessing and a strong reminder to be faithful to God, Joshua sent these tribes home to their families. They were excited to be going home and thankful after so many years of being away and so many years of fighting the enemy. But a strange thing happened on their way home. In verse 10 of chapter 22, it says, "And when they came to the region of the Jordan, that is in the land of Canaan, the people of Reuben and the people of Gad and half the tribe of Manasseh built there an altar by the Jordan, an altar of imposing size." And what did they build? They built a beautiful altar. And was this a good thing or a bad thing? Well, we're going to find out in verse 12. "When the people of Israel heard this, the whole assembly of Israel gathered at Shiloh to make war against them." So the rest of the Israelites are pretty angry about this. The Israelites were angry to hear about an altar, and they were afraid that their brothers were turning away from God to serve idols. So they wanted to go to war. They had learned lessons in battle, and they didn't want to see their brothers going down this path. But before they sent people down to fight, they sent a person named Phinehas, the son of the high priest, to find out what really happened here. So he went down to talk to these tribes, Reuben, Gad, and half the tribe of Manasseh, and the tribes were able to explain their motives. They explained the reason they did what they did. They wanted their brothers to understand this as well and know what was in their hearts. So we're going to read chapter 22, verses 26 through 27. "Therefore we said, let us now build an altar, not for burnt offering or for sacrifice, but to be a witness between us and you, and between our generations after us, that we do to perform the service of the Lord in his presence with our burnt offerings and sacrifices and peace offerings to your children. Will not say to our children in time, come, you have no portion in the Lord." So did they mean to make this altar to take place of the altar of God? No. Did they plan to offer sacrifices and burnt offerings on this altar? Nope. So why did they build it? Well, they built it as a memorial to show their children, to show their own people and the generations to come that they worshiped the Lord. The 2 tribes and half the tribe lived in the east were not trying to go against God. They were reminding themselves and their families that they were a part of God, just like the tribes on the west. So the 10 tribes returned home, and they were glad that all had been cleared up, and the motives of the heart of their brothers remained with God. The people of Reuben and Gad and half the tribe of Manasseh gave this altar a special name. They called it Proof That We Believe That the Lord is God. So those are our 5 points to the promises of God. Isn't it wonderful that God's people could talk things out and find out the reason they did what they did? Both sides got to explain their motives, and both found they were putting God first. We learn from this story that motives, what is in your heart, and the reasons you do what you do matters. In conclusion, God has kept every promise he has made to the Israelites. No promise has failed. Every one came true. And we can stand on the promises of God because his promises never fail. His promises will lead us closer to him. So we're going to review real quick the 5 points to these promises of God. Number 1, the work must go on. Number 2, faith moves mountains. Number 3, accidents happen. Number 4, surrounded to serve. And number 5, motives matter. These are good points, but what do they mean to you? Let's apply these truths to our lives, and we'll let God's truth sink in a deep way and make a difference in the way we live. And here is a little worksheet that if y'all want to pause and look at and complete after you finish the video, it lists out all of the points and you have to fill in the blanks for what they are. And then on the other side, it lists verses from the New Testament that kind of correlate with each point. So this would be a great worksheet for you and your siblings or your family to do together to remember the 5 points of the promises of God.